Imagine being 5 years old. You're not in a warm schoolroom with crayons and colourful picture books. Instead, you're on a frozen hillside, your small hands numb, your fingers frostbitten, as you try to keep a herd of goats from wandering. You're hungry, you're cold, and you are one of the lucky ones. Because 1 out of every 3 Viking children won't survive to your age. This isn't a fairy tale. In the Viking world, childhood wasn't a protected, magical chapter of life. It was a battlefield. It was a desperate daily fight against hunger, disease, and the biting, relentless elements. This is the brutal, often tragic, and rarely told story of what it was really like to grow up in Viking society. Before a Viking child could even open their eyes to the world, they faced their first and most formidable enemy, death. In the Viking Age, childbirth wasn't the private, sanitized process we know today. It was a dangerous gamble, played out in the smoky shadows of a longhouse, on sheepskin-covered beds, with only midwives or family to help. There were no doctors, no sterile tools, and certainly no pain relief. There was only the sound of bone-deep screams, hot cloth, and the ancient wisdom whispered from one generation of women to the next. If the birth was difficult, as many were, it could spell death for the mother, the child, or both. A breech baby, or a child born in the dead of winter, when food was scarce and fuel for the fire was low, might be met not with joy but with a sense of dread. But even a successful, healthy birth didn't guarantee life. In Viking society, life was precious, but it was also conditional. A father held the legal right to reject a newborn if it was deemed weak, deformed, or was illegitimate, especially if born to a slave. This practice was known as exposure, and it was as chilling as it sounds. The infant would be carried out, sometimes by a servant, sometimes by the father himself, and left to the elements, in a forest on the edge of a fjord, or atop a cold, barren hillside. There the gods, or perhaps the wolves, would decide the child's fate. While we don't know exactly how common this was, the sagas and law codes mention it often enough to confirm it was a known practice. Some scholars believe it was a grim form of population control during times of famine, while others see it as the harshest edge of Viking practicality. For the infants who were accepted, picked up by their fathers, and formally recognised as kin, a new struggle began. The fight to survive the first year. And most didn't make it. Skeletal analysis from Viking cemeteries across Scandinavia reveals a truly astonishing mortality rate. Roughly 1 in 3 infants died before their first birthday. In some villages, it may have been as high as half. The causes of death were many and merciless. Disease was rampant. Without clean water or modern sanitation, infants could easily succumb to diarrhea, pneumonia, or simple infections. Malnutrition was a constant threat. Breastfeeding mothers often had poor diets, especially during the long, harsh winters, which meant their milk supply was insufficient. And the cold was a relentless killer. Longhouses were drafty, and fires were kept small to conserve precious fuel, filling the air with smoke. Babies were swaddled in wool and fur, but when the deep cold of a Scandinavian winter set in, it killed quickly and silently. When a child fell sick, there were no medicines, no antibiotics, no hospitals. All a family had were herbs, heated stones, charms, and desperate prayers to gods like Air, the goddess of healing, or Frigg, the protector of mothers and children. Sometimes a healing charm would be carved into a piece of wood or bone and placed near the cradle. But as most parents knew all too well, the gods did not answer every plea. The burial sites of Viking infants are heartbreaking. Some are buried with small touching offerings, tiny beads, fragments of wool, or small carved toys. Others, especially those who died unbaptized after Christianization began, were buried without ceremony, outside the sacred ground of the cemetery, seen as lost souls. Yet even in this brutal reality, there was hope. Some children did make it. They lived to walk, to laugh, to speak their first words, and these survivors were cherished. Their names were often chosen from ancestors, keeping the family memory alive. A boy might be named for a warrior uncle who had fallen in battle, a girl for a grandmother who held the homestead together through a brutal winter. To live past the age of 1 was a victory, a triumph over the cold, over hunger, and over fate itself. But this was not the end of hardship. For a Viking child, it was just the beginning. Now they had to work. If a Viking child survived their first perilous winter, they earned no reward, no respite, only a harder life. Because in the Viking world, once you could walk, you could work. The modern concept of childhood as a time of protected innocence simply did not exist. There were no playrooms filled with toys, no gentle lullabies unless they were sung by a mother working at her loom. You wouldn't get a bowl of warm porridge unless you had helped to grind the grain. In Viking society, usefulness was value, and value was survival. By the age of 4 or 5, a child was no longer considered a baby. They were a labour in training. From sunup to sundown, the Viking homestead was a relentless factory of effort, and every member of the household, even the smallest, had a job to do. Young boys started learning the fundamentals of farming and animal husbandry. They were sent out to herd sheep and goats, often alone for hours at a time, on cold, windswept hillsides. They learned to chop firewood, struggling with axes that were heavy and dangerously sharp. They hauled buckets of water from streams that were sometimes a quarter-mile away, their small bodies straining under the weight. They chased chickens, fed pigs, and cleaned up manure, filthy, exhausting but vital work. Young girls, meanwhile, were trained for a future within the longhouse, though their labour was just as punishing. They helped prepare food, plucking feathers from birds, skinning fish, and stirring heavy stews over the fire. They foraged for wild herbs and berries, learned to spin wool with clumsy, developing fingers, and were taught to weave cloth on looms that towered over them. They tended the fire, cared for younger infants, and learned the ancient rhythms of domestic life, passed down through their mothers' hands. For both boys and girls, a mistake could mean disaster. If you let the goats wander too far, they might be lost forever to the wilderness or to predators. If you dropped the clay jug while fetching water, the family might have none for their supper. If you cut your hand on a tool, that wound could easily fester and become deadly. There was no margin for error. Childhood was a constant test of endurance. And the weather didn't care how old you were. Winters in Scandinavia were cruel, with short days and long freezing nights. Children were bundled in woolen tunics, animal hides, and fur-lined boots, but even the best garments would soak through in the relentless sleet. Imagine a 6-year-old trudging through snow up to their thighs, hands red and raw, dragging a heavy sled of kindling. Or a 5-year-old girl, crouching by a smoky fire pit, stirring a bubbling broth with blisters forming on her small fingers. Viking childhood was dictated by the calendar of the seasons. Spring meant planting seeds, chasing birds from the barley fields, and tending to newborn livestock. Summer brought the grueling work of haymaking, fishing, and gathering herbs under a sun that barely set. Autumn was a frantic race to harvest crops, preserve food, slaughter animals, and salt or smoke the meat for the long winter ahead. And winter was a time for indoor work, mending clothes, spinning wool, tending the fires, and desperately trying to keep the animals alive. The workload never stopped, it just shifted. Discipline was not personal, it was pragmatic. If you failed at a task, you might be scolded, whipped, or humiliated in front of the entire household. The family simply couldn't afford carelessness when every mistake was a direct threat to their collective survival. In the Viking world, there were no classrooms, no chalkboards, no alphabet songs. Yet, education was relentless, immersive, and inherited. Viking children learned not through lectures, but by living the lessons every single day. They learned by watching their elders, by doing the work themselves, and by listening. Always, always listening. From the moment a child could speak, they were surrounded by stories, rituals, and the practical tasks of life. There was no separation between education and living. Learning was survival. A boy watched his father split logs, mend tools, and train with weapons, and then he would pick up a piece of wood and try to copy him. A girl observed her mother spinning wool, stirring porridge, and tending to the livestock, and she did the same. Every action had a purpose, every mistake had a consequence, and every single task was a lesson. But the most powerful lessons didn't come from chores, they came from stories. Viking children grew up listening to the voices of their ancestors. At night, gathered by the flickering firelight, elders would tell the great tales of gods and monsters, of heroes and epic deeds. These were not just bedtime stories. They were moral frameworks, identity builders. Through these sagas, children learned about Odin's relentless quest for wisdom, Thor's mighty strength and terrible temper, and Loki's cunning mischief and treachery. They heard of great warriors who died with glory and of cowards whose names were never to be spoken again. These stories taught children how to behave, how to speak, and how to remember. In an oral culture, a strong memory wasn't just admired, it was a necessity. You were expected to memorize names, bloodlines, battles, laws, and proverbs. If your family's history was forgotten, you were rootless. If you couldn't recall the names of your kin, you couldn't claim your inheritance or your honour. Most Viking children were not literate in the modern sense, but some, particularly the children of nobles, merchants, or skalds, learned to read and carve runes. Runes were the Viking alphabet, a set of simple, angular characters designed to be scratched into stone, wood, and bone. A child might start by carving their name into a piece of driftwood, then the name of a god, then a simple phrase like "Thor bless this house." Through listening and observing, children also absorbed the complex social rules of their society. They learned what it meant to break an oath, why family loyalty came before everything else, and how a person's reputation could mean the difference between life and death. Even small children were expected to know when to hold their tongues, to speak clearly when addressed, and to never, ever bring shame upon their kin. They were taught to fear dishonour more than death itself, because a bad death could be forgiven, but a dishonourable life could not. By the age of 10, a Viking child was no longer innocent. They were forged by fire, shaped by story, and driven by the immense weight of their legacy. But now came the hardest lesson of all: how to survive pain, how to withstand cold, hunger, and grief, and still keep going. Because the Viking world never gave its children time to rest. There is no romance in Viking childhood, only a harsh reality, and that reality was filthy, dangerous, and unforgiving. By any modern standard, Viking children lived in what we would consider a constant state of survival mode. Let's start with the home. Viking families lived together in longhouses, long, narrow, dark buildings made from timber, turf, and thatch. These were not cosy cabins, they were functional survival machines. The average longhouse had 1 or 2 open fire pits but no chimney. Smoke from cooking and heating fires simply drifted upwards and lingered, slowly seeping out through the roof. The air was constantly thick with soot and ash, and children likely suffered from chronic coughs and respiratory problems. The floors were usually packed dirt, sometimes layered with straw or animal hides. Vermin like rats and fleas were a constant problem, sharing the warmth of the longhouse with the family. And in the winter, the family's livestock, sheep, goats, pigs, and even cows, were brought inside to protect them from freezing. The sounds, the smells, and the droppings of these animals were simply part of the domestic environment. Children slept side by side with their siblings, parents, and the animals, wrapped in wool blankets and furs. There was no privacy and no peace, just the shared warmth and the hope that it would be enough to survive the night. Outside the longhouse, the Scandinavian climate posed another constant threat. For much of the year, life was wet, cold, and muddy. Spring brought melting slush. Summer brought swarms of biting insects, and autumn reeked of rot and animal slaughter. And winter was a long white predator. Children still had to gather fuel, fetch water, and tend to animals, sometimes walking miles to pastures or frozen streams. There were no snow days, only the ever-present danger of getting lost in a whiteout or slipping on the ice near a fjord. Food insecurity defined Viking life, and children felt it first and most acutely. In good years, meals might be hearty stews of barley and meat, dried fish, bread and dairy products. But in bad years, children might survive on watery porridge, thin bone broth or boiled roots. They would go to bed hungry, their stomachs cramping, knowing that tomorrow might be even worse. Malnutrition left its mark. Studies of Viking Age skeletons reveal stunted growth, signs of starvation in the teeth, and rickets from poor nutrition and lack of sunlight. Viking children were not shielded from grief. They were drenched in it. Siblings died. Cousins died. Mothers sometimes died in childbirth, and fathers were lost on raids. Some children were orphans by the age of 8. They learned to carry trauma without pause. Emotional suppression wasn't just encouraged, it was required for survival. There were no counsellors, no lullabies to ease their fears, no distractions from loss. There was only the grind and the expectation that no matter how much it hurt, you had to keep going. It might surprise you to learn that even in the harsh, bone-chilling world of the Viking Age, children still played. They played between their chores, inside smoke-filled longhouses, and out in the meadows where their ancestors might have fallen in battle. And through that play they learned not just how to laugh, but how to live. Because in the Viking world, play wasn't just about fun, it was about training. Viking play mirrored Viking life. There were no plush toys or plastic swords. Instead, children had miniature versions of the adult world. Archaeologists have uncovered small wooden swords and spears carved by hand, tiny boats whittled from driftwood, animal figurines carved from bone or antler, and even small shields, light enough for a child to carry. These were not decorations. They were made to be used and used hard. Young boys fought mock battles with sticks and wooden axes, mimicking the combat they had seen or heard about in the sagas. They learned footwork, how to block an attack, and how to move as a unit. And though they may have been laughing, these children were learning how to kill. Girls, too, played imitation games, but theirs reflected the immense responsibilities of Viking womanhood. They rocked dolls wrapped in scraps of cloth, training for motherhood. They staged mock marriages, with hand-fasting ribbons, training for the strategic alliances that would define their futures. But it wasn't all physical. Some Viking games were designed to sharpen the mind. One of the most popular was Hnefatafl, a strategy board game similar to chess, but older and more asymmetric. In Hnefatafl, one player must defend a king in the centre of the board, while the other commands a larger force of attackers. The game taught foresight, sacrifice, and how to protect something valuable under immense pressure. To teach a child Hnefatafl was to teach them how to think like a chieftain. Of course, not every game was so purposeful. Like all children, Viking kids craved movement and fun. They ran, jumped, and wrestled. They played with spinning tops carved from antler and tossed balls sewn from animal bladders. But even these innocent games served a deeper function. They honed the body, training balance, strength, and reflexes. A child who could dodge a thrown stick might one day dodge an enemy's blade. Viking play wasn't supervised the way it is today. Risk was expected, even encouraged. If a child got bruised, it was a lesson learned. Pain was a teacher. But for those who survived, these games were a rite of passage, a way to grow strong without even realizing you were being shaped for the harsh world ahead. You survived infancy. You learned to work. You weathered the harsh winters, and even found moments of laughter in your play. But even now, stronger, smarter, and nearly grown, you are not safe. Because in Viking childhood, death was never far away. The cold, hard truth is that even if a Viking child made it past the age of 5, an achievement a third of their peers never saw, their struggle for survival was far from over. Skeletal remains from Norse settlements in Denmark, Norway, and Iceland tell a grim story. Children between the ages of 5 and 12 continue to die at alarming rates, not just from disease, but from accidents, injuries, exposure, and violence. In some excavated settlements, as many as half of all burials were for individuals under the age of 15. Imagine the daily risks. A slip while carrying water on icy rocks could lead to a fractured limb, unconsciousness, and freezing to death. An accidental kick from a cow or a bite from a stray dog could lead to a fatal infection. Open fires meant burns were common, and with no modern medicine, an infected burn could easily kill. The tools of daily life, axes, knives, carving tools, were sharp, heavy, and unforgiving. And then there was the threat of human violence. Viking society was not peaceful. It was built on a foundation of raiding, feuding, and defence. If a village was attacked by a rival clan, children were not spared. The sagas tell of children being taken as slaves after raids. Even among free children, blood feuds could claim young lives, as a child could become collateral damage in an adult's war for honour. But the most silent killer remained disease. The cold, damp longhouses, the shared space with livestock, and the lack of sanitation created the perfect breeding ground for sickness like measles, dysentery, and tuberculosis. And when illness struck, it often swept through a household, taking everyone at once. There are records of entire families being buried together, parents and children laid side by side in mass graves that speak of plague or famine. For those who lived near the coast, the sea was both life and death. By age 10 or 12, many boys were already learning to sail, joining fishing trips or even longer expeditions on treacherous longships. A sudden storm or a single wrong move could send you into the freezing water, where death would come in minutes. No matter how strong you were, the ocean was always stronger. There was no single moment when a Viking child became an adult. No official birthday, no certificate, no candles on a cake. Instead, adulthood arrived like a storm on the horizon, gradually, and then all at once. One day you were helping your father mend a fence. The next, you were handed a real axe and told to stand guard through the night. In Viking culture, There were no real teenagers. There were only children, and then there were adults. And the shift between the two was determined not by age, but by responsibility. For most, adulthood began between the ages of 12 and 15, though it could come much earlier if circumstances demanded it. For a boy, a major signpost was his first successful hunt, when he brought home meat for the family. For a girl, it might be the first time she wove a complete piece of cloth, sturdy enough to be worn or bartered at market. These moments brought pride, but also immense pressure. Once you proved you could do adult work, you were expected to do it for the rest of your life. For boys, coming of age was tied to strength and readiness for combat. Around age 12 or 13, a boy might be gifted his first real blade, a short knife, often with his name carved into it in runes. It was a symbol that he was now a man in training. By 15, many Viking males were already participating in raids, trading voyages, or standing as guards for their homesteads. Childhood was over. For girls, adulthood came just as swiftly and just as harshly. By 13 or 14, a girl was already seen as a potential wife. Many were married by 15 or 16, often not by their own choice. Marriages were strategic alliances designed to merge land claims or cement trade relationships. But a Viking woman was not powerless. With marriage, she was gifted a ring of iron or bronze keys, which she wore at her belt. These keys unlocked the food chests and storerooms, symbolizing her control over the household. The girl who once played with bone dolls was now responsible for running a farmstead, managing food supplies, and raising children, often while her husband was away at sea. The stakes were enormous. If she failed, her family might not survive the winter. We've talked about the cold, the hunger, and the loss. But we haven't yet spoken about what might be the most powerful and enduring force in the Viking world: love. Because even in a world carved from frost and fire, where death was a constant companion, Viking parents loved their children. Fiercely, desperately, and quietly. They didn't express love in the ways we might recognise today. There were no bedtime songs, unless they were sung while spinning wool. No casual "I love yous." But there was profound care. It was in the mother rising before dawn in a freezing longhouse to warm goat's milk for a sick baby. It was in the father patiently showing his son how to sharpen a knife, knowing that skill might one day save his life. It was in the sister carefully wrapping her brother's feet in fur before he went out into the snow. In Viking society, love wasn't words. It was action. It was survival. Names held deep significance. Children were often named after deceased relatives, a way of carrying a beloved soul forward into a new body. It was a form of immortality, a way of saying, "You are part of us. We remember. We carry them in you." The graves of children tell a story the living rarely spoke aloud. Excavations have revealed children's graves with touching offerings left behind by grieving parents. A tiny wooden horse resting beside the bones of a 4-year-old boy, a small whalebone spindle whirl lying next to a girl no older than 6, beads and broken toys tucked into the earth. These were not offerings to the gods. They were tokens of love left by parents who could not bear to send their children into the afterlife empty-handed. Grief in the Viking world was not paraded or performed, but it was there, deep and enduring. The sagas, when they do mention child loss, are sparse but brutal. He stood beside the grave for 3 nights. Then he spoke no more. The Norse were not cold-hearted. They were simply expected to endure, to carry their grief like any other heavy burden, on the back, through storms, up mountains, and into battle. And yet through it all, love endured. It was the only warmth the longhouse could truly guarantee. Those who survived a Viking childhood were not ordinary. They were hardened. They carried in their bones the memory of hunger, in their muscles the toil of early labour, and in their hearts the ghosts of siblings and friends who did not make it. They became the settlers of Iceland, the raiders of Britain, and the traders of Constantinople. Their incredible resilience built a culture that endured for centuries. Now you know what it truly meant to grow up Viking. Not in the world of fantasy, but in the dirt and the cold, in the blood and breath of a world where childhood was a crucible. There were no soft landings, no second chances, only survival or silence. To be a child in Viking society meant living with constant gnawing uncertainty. Would you survive the winter? Would you live past your 5th birthday? Would your name be remembered, or forgotten in the cold earth? Those who made it through were not lucky. They were forged through loss, through labour, and through the relentless expectations of a world that could not afford weakness. And yet, even in all that hardship, there was beauty. In the bond between siblings huddled near a fire, in the joy of a carved toy boat floating down a stream, in the quiet pride of a child's first woven cloth. These children didn't just inherit Viking culture, they built it. One chore, one story, one sacrifice at a time. So the next time you hear the grand tales of Norse warriors, of longships slicing through icy waves, of gods and heroes carved into stone, remember the children. Remember that before there were warriors, there were children with cold hands and quiet courage, and they are the reason the Viking world endured. If this journey into the brutal reality of Viking childhood has opened your eyes, please click that like button. It helps more people discover this hidden history. And subscribe for more deep dives into every corner of Viking life. Let us know in the comments, what part of this life do you think you would have struggled with the most? The hunger, the cold, the violence, or the heavy silence after loss? Until next time, keep your hearth burning, and never forget the ones who came before you.